Thank you guys for showing up and coming to listen to me, especially despite like technical difficulties. And thank you to Karen, of course, for inviting me here to talk about my writing journey and process. So first, my name is Stella, and like Karen, my work has been recognized by Young Arts and Scholastic Writing Awards, and it's been published in some literary magazines like Narrative and Craft and Four Way Review. I also work on the staffs for some literary magazines, and I have a prose chapbook that was recently released with River Glass Books. So I've been, I guess, part of the teen writing community for a few years now, and I've kind of seen, I guess, many sides of it and participated in it a lot. So since I guess you guys are kind of entering that world now, I hope that like me telling you guys about my experiences or my journey and so on and so forth will be maybe like informative or helpful in some way. If you want to contact me after this meeting, you can do so at stellalay04@gmail.com if you want to like ask me more questions or ask for like resources regarding some stuff that I'm going to talk about later. Okay, great. So I started writing when I was very young. In elementary school, I just really loved storytelling in general. And I was always drawn to, very compelling characters that I would read about in my favorite books or just like imagery. I was very fascinated by imagery and by line. So I began like writing this fantasy novel with my friend in like third grade. And that's sort of how I began writing for fun and writing consistently. In middle school, which I think is the age that many of you guys are, is when I started learning more about craft and about writing techniques and approaching writing from a more systematic way. So my school had this program called Writing Seminar, where we would learn about poetry or short story or flash fiction and start to experiment within these genres, which is, I guess, how I began learning about having a more like systematic writing process or approaching or thinking more critically about writing and editing and revising and so on and so forth. That course also made me fall in love with the forms of short story and flash fiction, which I didn't even really realize were possible until then. And those are now the forms that I primarily write in. Yeah, after middle school, I began, well, I guess like in the last year of middle school, 8th grade, I began participating in contests like Scholastic. And that was kind of how I was introduced to the world of writing contests, which later led me to publishing and editing, editing and programs and things like that, which you guys might be interested in high school. So since I guess in high school, there is a lot of pressure surrounding extracurriculars and things like that. So I know I definitely felt that pressure, like I had to be the best or I had to do XYZ in order to, get accepted into college or, get like recognition so I could be on par with my peers. So that was definitely a big source of anxiety for me, and I know for a lot of other teen writers. So I just wanted to say that it's great that you guys are already writing and spending your free time writing and learning about writing. And I just want to encourage you guys to continue writing for fun and to prioritize that fun aspect and writing what you want to write about and what is compelling to you rather than worrying too much about will this, will I get like recognition for this, or will this help me get into a good school or so on and so forth, because from personal experience, I've found that type of thinking can really hinder your writing and make it much more of a chore or a job, which is like the opposite of what you want it to be, especially since you're so young. So contests and publications are, of course, things that can be fun to participate in and can be very validating. But I just wanted to emphasize that they're not everything and they're not like a measure of your worth. So especially as you go into high school, I kind of want you guys to keep that in mind. And, taking a step back and just writing for yourself for periods of time is also a good practice. Yeah. So, so earlier I mentioned about how that anxiety can be something that sort of hinders your writing. So for me, I actually kind of stopped writing very consistently in like ninth and 10th grade because I was facing like a lot of pressure, a lot of outside pressure, and I never felt like I could be like good enough or that I was ever producing at like a high enough quality. And that kind of production focused mindset really, I guess, like I said before, really made it feel like a chore and made it, very stressful, made writing a very stressful process. But one thing that helped me get back into it was discovering a great community of teen writers online, who I could, talk to about writing or about other things, and who could, edit my pieces with me and who I could, exchange edits with. So I learned a lot from these people, both about writing itself and about how fun writing can be again, which is what made me, start writing more consistently and start experimenting with different forms like poetry, and really made me return to writing in the way that I have now. So without this community, I definitely would not be writing as much or as good as I am currently. So I'm very grateful for that. And I know you guys are already kind of together in this online space, which is really great. So I guess I don't know how well you all know each other, but I think as you enter the teen writing community, I really want to emphasize that there is a community aspect that can make it such an enjoyable experience or a much more fun experience. And that many of the people who I met through teen writing became some of my closest friends, some of who I'm going to college with. And yeah, so I think that can kind of enrich your life, both inside and outside of writing. And of course, being surrounded by people who are so inspiring, and so, talented and passionate in itself is also a driving force that helped motivate me to improve myself and to just keep working on my craft. So I think community is a great thing. There are some negative parts of the teen writing community, in that in some areas it can be like very competitive, or I know like plagiarism is kind of a problem. But if you kind of keep the mindset that I mentioned before, where you try to prioritize writing for yourself or writing for fun rather than for external validation, I think that can help you sort of avoid those things. Yeah, so like I said a little bit earlier, when I re-entered the teen writing community, I met a lot of poets and people who were working in that genre, whereas I had previously only been writing prose and like short stories and flash fiction. So I found that, when I saw all of these amazing poets who were like writing these beautiful things and like sharing them online, that sort of inspired me to begin working with this form that I had previously thought I was completely uninterested in. And I soon realized how wonderful, poetry can be and how it can express things that sometimes prose cannot, and the freedom that it provides. So, especially now, when you're, I guess, like younger, it can be really great to experiment with form and with genre, and to, cast a wide net and try to like figure out all of these things that you could potentially be interested in. Because, it's hard to say, oh yeah, I only do this and I'm not interested in doing that if you've never tried it before. And I think, establishing foundations in multiple genres can strengthen your craft all across the board. It can make you more versatile. It can give you larger range, and, techniques that you learn from poetry or from prose can be applied cross genre. So I think that is something that I sort of discovered and that really shapes the way that I write all of my work now. Hybrid work is also really interesting. I guess like in the realm of microfiction or prose poetry is one type of hybrid work that sort of blends the skills from poetry and prose more directly. You can also play around with art and writing, or like film and writing and things like that. Just experimenting with different things that you are already interested in to create something new can be a very fun generative process, and it can teach you a lot about both genres and about like yourself as an artist and a creator as well. Playing with structure in kind of a similar vein, I am a big believer that the structure of a piece should fit or amplify like the content or the themes of a piece. And I think that in experimenting with structure, you can find new innovative modes of storytelling or ways to like convey your ideas or your messages. And it can also feel, very liberating to do that, and instead of being stuck in the very traditional forms that you might be used to. This is especially relevant, I think, in poetry because it is by nature such a free form. So here is one of the, like, I guess, poems that I wrote that is very much like a hybrid piece and is something that was very experimental, but that I had a lot of fun with, and just like, I guess, like had a really good experience writing. So this was a poem that I published in OK Donkey magazine in April of last year. It's titled Anatomy of a House Fire, and it's basically like a diagram based poem in that, you have the floor plan of the house above and the like numbered sections below that sort of lead you through the floor plan. And this was one of the poems that I wrote when I was still like figuring out my style or the things that I value in craft. And it was just a really fun experiment because I kind of got to do whatever I wanted. And I found that this way of telling the story was much more interesting and compelling than maybe a more traditional narrative was. So yeah, basically what this boils down to is that I think, especially early on, you can try lots of different things and do a lot of experimentation to sort of figure out what you like and learn about, writing and yourself as a writer. Yeah, so another side of the writing world is editing and publishing. So of course, like you'll be writing your own pieces and you can submit these pieces to literary magazines. But on the flip side, you can also work for these literary magazines once you enter high school. And I found that that was actually a really great educational experience. One of the first literary magazines that I worked for was called Polyphony Lit, which is, I think it's completely high school run. So all of the staff members are current high school students. And then once you graduate, you kind of like leave the staff, I guess. It's I think it's one of the largest teen-run literary magazines, and it was a really great experience because for each like editor, or I guess for each piece that you are assigned to edit, you have to write like pages of specific comments regarding the piece on the line level or the paragraph level or the stanza level, as well as like a couple paragraphs of general comments regarding the piece's like thematic progression or the structural level or the pacing and things like that. So this really forced me to think about every single piece and to analyze every single piece on both a line level and a structural, more general level, which taught me a lot about what I value in craft and what makes a piece compelling to me, as well as how I can apply these ideas to my own work. Because ultimately, in the goal of these comments was not only to identify where a story or a poem was effective or ineffective, but also to provide explanation as to why it was effective or ineffective and actionable ways to improve parts of the piece that could be improved. So forcing myself to both identify, explain, and find actionable solutions to these things really shaped the way that I think about poetry and about fiction and how I revise my own work. The unfortunate thing about Polyphony, which was the magazine that I previously worked for, is that I believe you now have to pay to be a part of it, which is not great, but there are many, many other literary magazines and student-run literary magazines all around that are completely free and that you can join the staffs of. And I know some of them also, make you do that, like specific and general commentary. Some of them don't, but basically what I'm saying is there is a wide range of options for you to get a similar experience. If you don't think you would be able to manage like working for a literary magazine for months at a time, even just when reading a piece, even just forcing yourself to write down which lines you like, which lines aren't hitting you as hard or aren't as effective, and then saying like, I like this because XYZ, and just forcing yourself to identify what works and what doesn't work for you and potential solutions to the things that don't work for you. So forcing yourself into this process, I think, is a really important educational experience. And I want to emphasize like actively making yourself like write this out or type this out, because otherwise I know for me, I might just fool myself into thinking, yeah, I thought about this critically and I analyzed this carefully, when in reality I didn't. So just making yourself write that stuff out can be such a fast way of learning. I think that was the fastest learning I've ever done for writing in general. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal writing process and how I approach writing, from inspiration to drafting to revision. So first, I just want to say that I think when I was like about your age, I was like really struggling to think of things to write about. Sometimes I would be like, oh, I haven't had like enough life experience to have anything to say or to have anything to write about. But now I want to tell you that that's not true. And as Flannery O'Connor said, anyone who has survived their childhood has enough information about life to last them for the rest of their days. So even though maybe you don't have as much life experience as an adult writer or something like that, you still have had many unique and complex and compelling experiences that shape who you are and maybe shape the things that you write about. You don't even have to write about the exact things that you've experienced, but you have lived enough life to sort of encounter themes that you may be interested in exploring, or interesting details or images in real life that you could include in a piece. So these are all places where you can draw inspiration, even if you aren't writing about your own life necessarily. So that kind of brings me to my next point, in that inspiration is observation. So one really important thing to me in writing craft is using very specific, unique, and concrete details to illustrate a piece. So this applies to poetry, to fiction, to creative nonfiction, because what makes a piece to me is specificity and the unique perspective that only you can provide. Because there's kind of that saying, like, every story has been told before. So every theme has been written about many, many times. Maybe similar plots have been written about before, but if you write the piece from your own specific and unique perspective and talk about it in a way that avoids like generalizations and so on and so forth, it can feel fresh and new, and be compelling, despite the fact that people have written about these things before. And that's why people can still keep writing about love or grief, or fear, or so on and so forth, because everybody experiences these things in a different way and has something different to say about it. Yeah, so another big part of my writing process is finding inspiration from the mundane or the everyday. So like I said on the last slide, you have all lived enough life to write about it, and you can find inspiration just in anything. Like when you begin thinking about it in this way, you can kind of start noticing details in your everyday life that you might think, oh, that could be an interesting metaphor, or that could be an interesting image. And I remember very specifically one time I was like walking down the street and the like asphalt was kind of melted from the heat of the sun. So when I stepped in it, my shoe like left an imprint in it, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I ended up including that image, many years later in my novel draft that I submitted to Young Arts, and that won Young Arts. So it's noticing those little details everywhere and keeping like a list in your head or on a piece of paper or in a document of just things that are interesting and that you may want to return to later can be the source of much inspiration. Another thing that I do, because I'm on the internet a lot, is that I also like to find inspiration from like posts or tweets or videos that I see online. Because people talk about interesting things online all the time. By nature of a post, it's usually something worth mentioning at least. So one of the poems that I had published recently in Narrative magazine, titled "My Neighbors Make a Ghost," was inspired by a tweet that was talking about how people were making Halloween decorations like ghosts out of chicken wire, which I thought was really interesting and sort of combined the mundane with the surreal in a compelling way. So that is definitely something that you can do as well. Speaking of combining the mundane and the surreal, because a lot of the things that I write are magical realism or are surrealism, if you are interested in that type of writing, you can sort of take very normal details or images from everyday life and I guess like expand upon them in a surreal or a supernatural way to explore whatever theme it is that you want to explore or whatever idea it is. But basically, the gist of this slide is that you can find inspiration almost everywhere, and I encourage you to pay attention to the small details in your life and to take note of them. And when you're writing, you can conjure up these details to show your own specific and unique perspective in your work. In drafting, everybody drafts differently, so I'm just going to talk about how I do it. For prose, I will usually start from a very clear image or a line from which I will just kind of keep writing while searching for the direction that it's going in. I will usually take an image and, for example, in one of my stories, Graftings, I focused on the images of like oranges and fruit. And I used that as a jumping off point to talk about genetics and inheritance and family relationships and so on and so forth. So you can take this. So in my writing, I would take this image and circle it from many different angles and approach it from all these angles to see what new information or what new like thematic parallels I can pull from it. I know not everybody writes that way, so this is not a prescriptive recommendation. It's just something that I like to do. And in drafting, once I figure out where I want my story to go, I will usually come up with an ending of the story and the beginning of the story. And for the middle part, I will then try to guide my characters or the plot towards this ending so that it feels satisfying and so that it feels earned. I know that it's definitely not a universal experience because I've heard of many people just like writing through and then discovering the ending much later, but that is what I do. So if your writing process is similar to mine, maybe that's helpful. But I do ultimately think that in a short story or in a piece of flash fiction, the pieces should come together and build up to something that feels thematically resonant or I guess like satisfying in a way, even if the characters don't necessarily get exactly what they want. In a poem, I also start with image in a similar way. And because poetry is a much looser or more free form than prose, it's really easy to get lost in abstractions and things like that. So one thing that I like to emphasize in poetry is concrete and specific details, like I kind of said before, and grounding everything in the concrete and the specific and letting your abstract ideas sort of bloom out of that to let the poem like take flight, I guess, or give it its emotional life. Yeah, everybody is different in this process, so that's just kind of my experience and how I like to think about and approach it. In revision, yeah, so like I said earlier, editing other people's work and thinking about what works for other people's work and what may be less effective and how you can fix it or improve it is one way you can learn a lot about your craft values and what compels you and what you want to apply to your own writing. But I also want to emphasize, like, as you write a lot, you can kind of learn more about what type of writer you are and whether you're an overwriter or an underwriter and, you know, in what degree. So for me, I know that I am like a slight overwriter on the line level and a massive underwriter on the structural level. So I know I can expect to be cutting down some sentences and tightening up some imagery, but backfilling a lot of scenes and, you know, building up to the climax or to the resolution or expanding upon, I guess, the character's arc throughout the story. So I know what to expect in my own revision because through practice, I became familiar with the type of writer I am and the pitfalls that I tend to fall into. So when you are revising your own work or reading your own drafts, I encourage you to take note of where you often find yourself making edits, where you often find yourself saying like, my pacing may not be super good, or here I use like maybe too much purple prose, or and like so on and so forth. So becoming familiar with who you are as a writer, as well as what you value in craft can really guide you in revision. And of course, peer editing is also a major part of this. Like I said towards the beginning of the presentation, meeting my friends in teen writing and becoming a part of the community was really instrumental to me returning to writing and improving my writing at a pace that I hadn't before. And one big part of this was peer editing because everybody, you know, is a different writer and comes at craft in a different way. So finding people who can, you know, really zero in on what you are good at and what you may need to improve a little bit is so helpful because sometimes you just can't see that. And having an outside perspective is always helpful, especially friends who may be good at or not so good at things that are different from you. So you can both like supplement and help each other in that way. Yeah, so I think, yeah, so that was everything that I kind of wanted to talk about regarding my writing journey and my experiences in the teen writing community, as well as my writing process in general. So if you guys have any questions, I think we have like 10 minutes to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So this time definitely got kind of screwed up or got kind of screwed around.
Yeah.
So we'll just like take questions for maybe like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
If there aren't really any questions, Stella, could you like go to the slide maybe with like your contact information or something?
Yeah.
So if you are kind of wanting to reach out to Stella in regards to anything that she talked about today, you can find her there. And I also think I found her through her website or something like that. So once I post this as a YouTube video or post it on our website, I will send it to everyone with her website and other resources linked as well. But for the next 10 minutes, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat and she'll be eager to answer them. I guess like as I'll just like continue talking and asking questions, I guess, until we get some questions rolling in from other individuals. I think it's super cool that you wrote a book, and I think that a lot of my students definitely think of writing a book as something that seems very out of reach, I guess.
Mhm.
Could you like, I guess, I know it's definitely like a very complicating process, but
Mhm.
could you give us like a brief, like super, super vague outline of like how that would work or like what kind of happened along the way with that, I guess?
Yeah. And after this, someone messaged me privately, asking me another question, so I'll just do that right after this. But yeah, so I wrote a chapbook, which I guess is just a very short collection, in this case, of prose and arguably poetry. Some people have called it some poetry, but that's up for debate because I guess it is kind of hybrid. But it's a very short collection. It's about 30 pages and it's 5 individual pieces. So it's not a full book. I am working on a novel, but it's not done yet. So I won't talk too much about that. However, for this chapbook experience, um, I came up with the idea of writing a chapbook after 2 of the stories within it were already in existence. I had previously written my story Games and Changeling, and I have written them consecutively. So I was looking at them and I noticed a lot of commonalities thematically and imagery wise, that started making me think like, why am I drawn to these themes and these images, and what can I explore further? So from there, I sort of got the idea to write a chapbook, you know, about these things. And I drafted the remaining 3 pieces with those themes in mind and the motif, I guess, of hunger in mind. Um, I didn't want to outline very specifically, like, this story has to talk about XYZ and approach these ideas from this angle specifically, because I find that type of direction like kind of constricting. And I think one important part of my writing process is discovery and learning about the piece as I write it. So I didn't make myself do that, but in keeping the themes of like family and hunger and like cruelty and so on and so forth in the back of my mind, it kind of helped me make these pieces more cohesive and coherent as a whole. So once I had that manuscript, or like, yeah, once I had that manuscript, I obviously sent it out to like a lot of my friends asking them for feedback, and I revised it, and submitted it to River Glass, who eventually picked it up. Yeah, I also published several of these stories individually, in other literary magazines, just because I knew the chapbook would be a limited run. So that was a choice that I decided to make. But yeah, that's basically it. Yeah. Um, and regarding what is flash fiction, so flash fiction is a type of fiction or story writing or prose writing, I guess, that is characterized by being very short. So typically people will say flash is under 1,000 words, but then there is a subgenre of flash fiction called microfiction that is even shorter. And I've seen people say like 500 words for that. Flash nonfiction also exists, and it's the same idea except for creative nonfiction instead of, fiction. But basically, it is very compressed and is characterized by shortness, which changes the way that you have to approach the characters or the scene. And it can be really interesting because every word counts. So you have to force yourself to be very concise. And those constraints, I guess, helped me learn a lot and in like tightening up my writing, both on a line and a structural level. Yeah, so sometimes character development is hard for me. Do you have any tips? Yeah, so I think character is so important because to me, characters are ultimately what drives a work of fiction. Even in genre fiction or plot-based fiction, if your characters aren't super compelling, then the work itself might not be, super compelling. One thing about characters that I think is really important is that they need to have clear motivations, which can be a goal or a fear or a desire for something or other, no matter how big or small. And they have to actively pursue this rather than being just like a passive, rather than just being passive and letting things happen to them. So and like just like reacting to things happen to them. They have to actively take charge and try to do something in order to reach their goal. One thing that I also like to think about is the distinction between external motivation and internal motivation. So to me, complex characters need to have both, and they can line up sometimes, and sometimes they may diverge. But for me, external motivation is what the character very obviously desires and is like kind of going for on the outside, whereas internal motivation is something that is more important to them at the core and maybe may lead them to do things that seem contradictory to their external motivation, but that still makes sense and are consistent to the character because it is what they desire internally. That was really abstract because I didn't have like a clear example to talk from. So if you have more questions about that, feel free to email me. But I think thinking about motivation in that way is something really important to character creation and development. One last thing about characters is that I think characters, or at least very important characters, should be dynamic in some sense. So this can be character development as we normally think about it, in which a character changes as a person or comes to some revelation at the end of a story. And this can be triggered by many things, obviously. But I think that is very common in stories that take place over a longer period of time. However, for stories that take place over a very short period of time, that type of drastic change or revelation might be harder to make convincing. So to introduce like that dynamic quality for stories that take place over maybe just like a day or two, or like a week or something like that, you can also change the reader's perception of these characters by revealing new information or context or backstory that changes the way we view these characters and what they're doing and the situations that they're in. So those are two different ways that you can make characters dynamic and interesting. Yeah, I hope that made sense. If you have more questions, feel free to email me because I know that was a lot of like general abstract like theory. And then someone asked, if you're part of a writing group, is it okay to have more than one person edit your writing, or would that be confusing? I think it's definitely okay to have multiple people edit your writing. Maybe limit it to, maybe limit it depending on what you like know about yourself and your writing. I usually send my pieces to 2 or 3 different people, so that might be a good number to start with. I like doing that because each of my readers comes at my writing from a different perspective and they notice different things that maybe previous readers or myself didn't notice. However, I think in peer review or peer editing, it is really important to have a strong sense of what you want to convey in your piece and what your craft values are, and so on and so forth. So you have to know where you are coming from, because sometimes when your editors look at a piece, they may say things that diverge from your vision and what you want to convey. In that case, you can just like disregard their comments potentially. But yeah, so I think having a lot of editors can potentially be confusing because people may have conflicting opinions and then you don't know who to listen to. But one thing that can help with that is having a very strong sense of who you are as a writer and what you want to write about and what themes or messages or ideas you're trying to convey. As well as like how different techniques can like fit into that vision and strengthen your piece. Someone asked, do you write every day? How many hours do you write every week? How do you manage time? How to balance schoolwork and your writing? Yeah, so I do not write every day. I've actually haven't been writing super consistently recently because I have been busy with other things. Yeah, so on like a slow week, I may not write at all, which is not great. But on, I know some weeks last summer, I was writing a lot. I was writing 20 to 30 hours a week. So it really depends. I think if you're looking for something, let's see, if you are looking to be consistent and like disciplined with your writing, it's really helpful to set personal deadlines for yourself. So maybe you want to finish drafting this story but in like 2 weeks, and then you can sort of work towards that and budget your time in that way. Setting those types of short-term deadlines I find are really helpful to me, especially because I've been writing under deadline, I guess, a lot for the past couple of years to meet literary magazine submission deadlines or contest deadlines or application deadlines. So you definitely don't have to do any of those things, but I think setting short-term deadlines for yourself can be really good in motivating yourself, and in like creating a disciplined writing routine. I don't think anyone, well, maybe some people, I don't think you necessarily have to write every single day, just because, you know, sometimes you just have to take some time to think about your writing and to think about the themes and ideas and your characters and so on and so forth. And sometimes that thinking can take longer than a day, which is totally fine. And you need that space to reflect, so that you can come at your writing in a thoughtful, and like well thought out way, rather than just like writing randomly and then being dissatisfied with it in the end. So so that's basically my thoughts on that. But yeah, so the general gist is I don't write every single day. Some that can be helpful for some people, but I think it is important to take time to think about your writing. And also, if you have more urgent things like school or exams, you may want to focus on that just because it's more urgent. But actively making space and time for writing is also really important. So I guess balancing schoolwork and writing. Through high school, I definitely had a lot of schoolwork, but actively putting like a block of time in my calendar, like you are going to write from 8 to 10 p.m. And it doesn't matter, what other things you may not have done yet, because if you keep saying, oh, I'll do this after that, I'll do this after X, I'll do this after Y, then you're never going to do it. So just blocking out time like that can be really helpful in creating a more consistent writing routine. Yeah, I hope that like made sense.
Feel free to drop in your last minute questions. If there are no more questions, I think we're gonna maybe wrap it up here for today. I'll just give everyone like one last second, I don't know, to maybe get their questions in. But Stella, that was such an amazing talk. I really enjoyed kind of seeing the different perspectives you had to offer in terms of also just like working on the boards for a lot of magazines. I think that's a very, really well done, like viable option that a lot of people may not be really aware of, but it's also like a really good opportunity to grow your own writing passion and just to kind of continue like growing and learning and improving, which I think is really, really important. Are there any other questions, or are we kind of good to go, I guess? Okay, if it seems like no one else has any questions. Oh, does someone want to say
There was
something?
a private message. One last question. Who is your favorite writer? Yeah. So this is a hard question. I will say some of the writers who have actively influenced my style the most are Ocean Vuong and Kaiming Chang, because I'm really drawn to that evocative, and Yoko Ogawa, because I'm really drawn to that evocative, visceral image, like very image heavy writing style, since I was always interested in imagery, and in surrealism and fabulism, as genres. So their styles definitely influenced mine the most. And yeah. Oh yeah, one significant thing I think about Kaiming Cheng and Ocean Vuong is that they were poets before they were prose writers, and you can definitely see this in how they approach their fiction, and how they, structure their fiction writing and their imagery, and even the way they talk about characters. So I think that's really interesting in their writing, and it's something that I think is becoming more evident in my writing as I practice writing poetry and as I try to emulate writers who I look up to. So yeah.
No, yeah, that is such a really good point. I think like a lot of the lyricism is really, really important. And is also something that I personally also enjoy like reading a lot as well.
Thanks.
But again, feel free to drop any questions with Stella's contact. I will be releasing this video and all of the other resources just like whenever I can, probably in the next coming days. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you all so much for coming, even with all the crazy kind of Zoom nonsense. But I really appreciate it, and I'm sure Stella also really appreciates it as well. But you guys are pretty much good to go. Thank you all so much for coming, and stay tuned for the video and other resources to be linked and announced.